and it is normally used to represent relationships. The relationship indicate give an example of database. Rectangle, diamond, oval. Rectangle, diamond, oval. Entity, attribute, relationship. Here, diagram is a graphical representation of table entities in a database and the relationships between them. It was developed by is a graphical representation of tables entities in a diagram. In a diagram and the relationships between them. It was developed and in a database and the relationships between them and the relationships between them. It was developed by Peter Chen. Peter between them and the relationship in a database and the relationship between them. It was developed by Peter Chen. It was developed by Peter Chen. It was developed by Peter Chen. It was developed by Peter Chen in 19. It was developed by Peter Chen in 19. It was developed by Peter Chen in 19. It was developed by Peter Chen in 1976. It was developed by Peter Chen in 1976. It was developed by Peter Chen in 19. It was developed by Peter Chen in 1976. It was developed by Peter Chen in 1976. It was developed by is a graphical representation of tables, entities in a database and the relationships between them. It was developed by Peter Chen in 1976. 1976 year diagram used different symbols to represent three types of information. Year diagram used different symbols to represent three types of information. Year diagram used different symbols to represent three types three types of information. ER diagram use different symbols to represent three types of information. ER diagram use different symbols to represent ER diagram use different symbols to represent three types of information. ER diagram use different symbols to represent three types of information. ER diagram use different symbols to represent three types of information. ER diagram use different symbols. ER diagram use different symbols to represent three types of information. ER diagram use different symbols. ER diagram use different symbols. ER diagram use different symbols to represent three types of information. ER diagram use different symbols to represent three types of use different symbols to represent three types to represent ER diagram use different symbols. ER diagram use different symbols to represent three types. ER diagram use different symbols to represent three types. ER diagram use different symbols to represent three types. ER diagram use different symbols. ER diagram use different symbols to represent three types of information. ER diagram use different symbols to represent three. ER diagram use different symbols to represent three types. Use different symbols to represent three types three types of information as follows: rectangle, diamond, oval. Rectangle, diamond. Rectangle, diamond, oval. Entity, attribute relationship. Briefly describe database design. Briefly explain the database design process with the help of the diagram. Briefly explain the database design process. 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 Design process with the help of a diagram. Database design. Database design process. The major objective of database design is to map the conceptual data model to an implementation model. Is to map is to map the conceptual data model 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 to an to an implementation model. And the major objective of database model is to map the major objective of database design is to map the major objective of database design is to map the conceptual data model to an implementation. The conceptual data model to an and the major objective of database design is to map the conceptual data model to an implementation model. A particular DBMS must be able to process this model. A particular DBMS must be able to process this model. A particular DBMS must be able. A particular DBMS must be. The planning start when a customer requests to develop a database system. It consists of various activities.